Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Sun, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at Theatre Pass Marai. And I would like to welcome you to our second digital Prelude event. Our Prelude events are a series of free community events inspired by the themes of the shows in our current season. This event is inspired by our next digital show, Speculation, by Leslie Ting, co-presented with Numis. We are very grateful that you are able to be here with us today. While today will be a primarily auditory experience with ASL interpretation by our wonderful interpreter, Denica C. Brown, we would still like to encourage the practice of providing visual descriptions whenever possible. In that spirit, I am speaking as a Chinese Canadian woman with black chin-length hair and a round face. I'm currently wearing not pants, but a cream dress with a black brush stroke pattern. And like many folks right now, I am sitting in front of my bedroom door near a white closet with too many boxes on top. I also want to recognize that I am currently reading from a piece of paper because I sometimes get anxious when I'm speaking as myself. So I just ask for everyone's understanding of this accommodation for my neurodiversity. On behalf of Theatre Pass Marai, and as a settler and immigrant myself, I want to begin by gratefully acknowledging that I am currently streaming to you live from Tikaranto, Treaty 13 territory, and the land of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I believe that our guest today is on the lands of the Ucluelet First Nations. Here at Theatre Pass Marai, we embrace collaborative and collective values as exemplified by Indigenous cultures. And we are particularly inspired by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This agreement binds people on this land to share peacefully with their neighbors so that we may all have enough. There is one dish, one spoon, and no knife. In that spirit, we honor all who came before us, our own ancestors, as well as all the Indigenous caretakers, named and unnamed, recorded and unrecorded. On a similar note, I also want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event during Black History Month. As an East Asian woman and as a citizen of a colonial state, I've personally benefited from a system built by the labor of Black bodies, upon broken treaties and the violent oppression of our Indigenous and Black communities. When thinking about these acknowledgements, I often think about, well, okay, what's next? How do we move from empty words to action, to responsibility, to true solidarity and community support? One way, I think, is to pay attention. 2 days ago, members of the Indigenous youth organization, Braided Warriors, were violently removed by the Vancouver police from their peaceful occupation at the Chubb Insurance Office, who provides insurance for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I want to encourage everyone to keep their eyes on this and to follow at Braided Warriors on Instagram to hear their reconciliation manifesto. I also think a lot about how we can better redistribute our resources. How can we better provide care and support to every member of our community? Black Lives Matter Canada is currently in need of support for their Canada Black Mutual Aid Fund, which provides $250 microgrants to Black people experiencing hardships amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Please consider donating at blacklivesmatter.ca to support Black families, neighbors, workers, and communities whose lives have disproportionately and dramatically shifted during the pandemic. And I invite all our non-Indigenous and non-Black guests to join me in reflecting on how we can turn our words of acknowledgement into sustained solidarity and action, not just during February, but throughout the year. And now I'd like to welcome our Patron Services Manager, Caradwyn Kingstone, to talk about our front of house policies.
Hi, everyone. As Angela mentioned, my name is Caradwyn Kingstone, and I will be your front of house for today. As you all are doing, we just ask that you keep your video turned off and your microphone turned off. If you do, however, want to speak to our ASL interpreter, please feel free to put your video on. What you can also do is if you were to hover your mouse on my screen and click the three dots on the top right-hand corner, you can click hide non-video participants, and that way our ASL interpreter is the only video you see. Or you can hover over their video and click pin, and that way as well, the ASL interpreter will be the only screen you see. Another option we have here today is closed captions or open captions. So if you go on the bottom of your screen, you will see a button that has a CC icon as well as live transcript. And you can click show captions, and then captions will appear on the bottom of your screen. You can also click show transcript, and then the transcript of the conversation will appear on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can save or search within that. That's all I have to say. If you have any problems or any questions today, you can feel free to message me directly in the chat or send me an email, as I'll have that open as well. I'll pass it back to Angela.
Thank you, Caradwyn. This is Angela speaking again. As this is our first digital iteration of Prelude, we would also like to take a moment to acknowledge this digital platform upon which we are gathering, both the privilege of being able to access this technology, but also the toll this can have on our mental, social, and environmental health. Just some things we would like to keep in mind as we all embark upon this new frontier. Finally, I have the honor of introducing our special guest today, starting with our moderator, Darren Cooper. With over 15 years of experience in the accessibility field, Darren currently serves as an accessibility consultant with the City of Toronto. Prior to this role, Darren was the accessibility project manager with the Chang School of Continuing Education at Ryerson University. As a member of Theatre Passe Muraille's board of directors, Darren has been able to merge his two passions, theatre and accessibility, and is pleased to be in a position to support TPM staff as they advance accessibility and inclusion within the theatre. As a complement to his professional and voluntary experience, Darren holds an honors of Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies from the University of Windsor, a certificate in Municipal Administration from the Association of Municipal Managers, Clerks, and Treasurers of Ontario, and the Canadian Certified Inclusion Professional Designation from the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. In conversation with Darren, we are thrilled to welcome internationally acclaimed author, screenwriter, journalist, and performer, Mr. Ryan Knighton. Ryan's two memoirs, Cockeyed and Come On Papa, received numerous award nominations, including the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor. He has contributed to the American radio programs, This American Life, and The Moth, and has written for The New York Times, Outside, Esquire, The Globe and Mail, Popular Mechanics, The Observer, The Believer, Men's Health, Afar, Vancouver, Vice, The Sunday Telegraph, The National Post, and Salon, among other newspapers and magazines. His travel writing has taken him around the world and earned him 2 Thomas Lowell Awards, an Eddie/Ozzie Award, and a James Beard Media nomination. He is also a Sundance Lab Screenwriting Fellow and the recipient of the 2009 Alfred Sloan Prize from the Tribeca Film Institute for the feature adaptation of his memoir. As a screenwriter, Knighton has written for Universal Studios, Paramount Pictures, and 20th Century Fox, and has created several TV pilots for FX. Most recently, he writes as a producer for the network drama In the Dark. He is also a sought-after public speaker and storyteller who has performed at theaters, conferences, and universities around the world, including NASA, the University of London, UCLA, and MIT. He lives on Vancouver Island in the coastal village of Ucluelet. Surfing is his preoccupation. And despite that incredibly impressive resume, I'd personally like to think that Ryan's most illustrious honor is probably having his book Cockeyed as Theatre Pass Marai's book club selection for December. All jokes aside, I will finally stop talking and will pass it on now to our moderator for this afternoon, Mr. Darren Cooper.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome everyone to this conversation with Ryan Knighton. Welcome, Ryan, digitally to Theatre Pass Marai. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today. I thought, great. I thought we would spend the next 30 or so minutes just talking about Cockeyed, and then afterwards, a little bit more generally around your life as a writer and as a person with a disability living in these uncertain times during COVID. And for those who are just joining us today for the first time, as Angela mentioned, Theatre Pass Marai, as part of its book club back in December, read and discussed Cockeyed. And that was done with a number of staff, board members, and patrons. So Ryan, with that in mind and focusing on Cockeyed, I thought we would start our conversation. If you could just talk a little bit about the book in terms of why you chose to write it when you did, and any challenges or barriers that you encounter while writing it and getting it published.
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And this is the easiest commute I've ever had to an event. This is great. Visually, I have no idea what my environment is, but I'm in my daughter's bedroom, and I'll preemptively apologize if the audience hears coughing in the background. My daughter has a cough right now, but it's not the dreaded thing. So she was a little worried that people would think she was, in deep, dire trouble behind me, and I was doing nothing about it while I was doing this interview. Cockeyed, it's funny that, it's 15 years ago that it came out. I was a very different person, I think, back then now. But what went into it was actually an accidental memoir. I didn't actually set out to write a memoir. I actually started by trying to write some essays for a friend's website. So there's a writer in Toronto named Brian Fawcett who had created a website back when people made websites. And it was called Dooney's Cafe. And it was like a digital version of the actual Dooney's Cafe in Toronto. And he had asked me to maybe put together a couple essays about what it was like being blind. And I hadn't really written about it, to be honest. And he sort of said, don't tell me the sad story. Tell me what it's like to go to IKEA. And it gave me a permission and a point of view that I hadn't really considered, that I could actually write with blindness as a point of view on other things. It's not an absence of a point of view. It is a point of view. And so I started writing these sort of essays about different experiences, about how blindness changes language, about how blindness changed my relationship with my wife, and all sorts of stuff. But in order to make sense of those sort of essayistic observations, I ended up having to tell a bit of an accidental memoir, because my disease, retinitis pigmentosa, you don't go blind quickly, you go blind quite slowly. And so to make sense of anything I was saying, I had to tell you where I was in the chronology of my disease and its pathology. So that chronology sort of forced me to tell this memoir to make sense of the observations I wanted to really write about. And in the end, when I submitted the book to a publisher, she sort of, my editor sort of asked me to push the memoir more to the foreground. And I think if you read the book now, you can see or hear these sort of vestigial tales of the essays, like these little paragraphs that feel a little expository and a little more philosophical. And they're sort of embedded around these other things, like these narratives of my own life and the people around me and my family and stuff. So there's still these little nuggets of the essays left, but really the memoir came to the foreground. And I wrote it completely out of order because I hadn't intended to write a memoir, so I wasn't thinking about it that way. So I actually wrote the middle of the book at the very end, for example. And a year after I thought I was finished, there was like a chunk that was missing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it was a peculiar process, and I had no idea what I was doing when I set out to do it. I had no idea.
That's really interesting. And with having to write the middle a year after, how was that in terms of your process? Did you have to go back and sort of reread what you had written before to make it fit with the rest of the book, or how did that process work?
It was one of the biggest lessons from the book. I mean, the thing that I didn't anticipate is that when you write a memoir, you change your memory. Like you are actually ossifying your own memories. So you remember your life in these flashes and in these very short narrative constructs. But it's not like we spend a lot of time with a memory revisiting it like a piece of drama and having to account for every point of view in it. Like, if you write about your family, they're now characters in a story, and you have to consider the story from their point of view too, which in the speed of real life, you don't necessarily have time or the inclination to do. So it's a different experience of your own memories. And in my case, in the book, there's a time period in which my second brother, Rory, died of a drug overdose. And I had left it out of the original draft of the memoir. I didn't write about that event at all. When I handed in the manuscript to my editor in New York, the first thing she came back with was she said, there's this period of time where you seem to be at a certain place in your life. And then the next chapter, things are very different. And I can't quite follow the leap. Emotionally, what happened in that period of time? And I said, well, this thing happened with my brother. And she's like, well, why isn't that in the book? And I said, because the book isn't about that. Like, it already feels a little bit like you're telling the story about a guy losing his sight. You don't want to add another hat on top of that hat of like, and he had a brother who died of drug overdose. It just felt like too much. And off topic. Like, it didn't feel to me like it had to be told to be part of understanding blindness. And my editor said to me the most revelatory thing. She said, well, for you not to write about it, that's convenient for you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's convenient for the book. So she asked me to go back and write a chapter about what happened to my brother to see if it fit. And in doing so, it made sense of so much for me that I was avoiding. And it was a kind of work that I'd been avoiding in the book too. And it pulled it all together. And I've said this in other interviews, but like when I handed in the manuscript, it was about 120,000 words, and we cut it down to 72. And the way we cut it was, my editor said to me, before we start editing, I want you to take a week and I want you to come up with one sentence. And in that sentence is, what is this book about? And when you answer that question, you cannot use the word blindness. And if you take blindness out of that answer, you will have the razor that we can use to cut this book down, because we will know what's relevant to it. And it was really hard. And what I ended up coming up with was, it's basically a coming of age story about a boy becoming a man and a disabled man at the same time, but he thinks a man and a disabled man is a contradiction. So it's really about masculinity. And when I looked at it from that point of view, like the sort of my relationship to blindness became much clearer to me what it was about, because I had no model for how to go blind, and I had no model for what it was to be a blind man. It's like I was raised by a sighted father, and so like my model fell away with it. So that was part of, I learned so much from writing this book that I still carry with me, but that lesson about editing it and what it was about, I still use that lesson when I'm doing a second draft of anything. I ask that question, what it's about, and I don't use the keyword that I think it's about.
That's a really interesting about what you said in terms of sort of reconciling your identity as a man and as a person who is blind, and how to accept yourself as a man who is blind. And I think for anyone who acquires blindness later on in life, they have to sort of come to terms with how to incorporate their disability into their identity. And it seems like the Cockeyed helped you do that.
It did, yes. People have asked me over the years, like when I lost my sight, I don't really have an answer. I believe you have RP as well.
I do, yeah.
You probably know what I mean. Like there is no moment. There's no, like, I don't think it was the moment when I picked up the white cane, because you pick it up a little early so that you can start sort of telling your eyes that they are not needed anymore.
Yes, exactly.
You have to learn to distrust them, and you have to sort of demote them. And the cane, you take it up early to demote your eyes in your physiological hierarchy.
Yes.
And in my case, it's like, what was the moment I lost my sight? I don't know. I don't know when it was, but I can say when I finished writing Cockeyed, that's when I became a blind man. Like the finishing of the book is when that identity became part of me. And there was a moment, I know, physiologically that was profound for me. And I was in my apartment. My wife and I lived in a loft on the industrial area in Vancouver. And there was a car accident outside, and I didn't go to the window to look, even though I could still see a little bit. And it was sort of that feeling like, you hear a sound and it wants to be completed by being looked at.
Right.
And I didn't feel any compunction to go to the window. And so I knew at some point prior to that, I'd become a blind person,
I can certainly relate, because the same is the case for me. I don't need to go to the window now to know exactly what's happening on the street, just from the sounds. That's really interesting. I know for myself, it took me a while to really accept the importance of using a white cane, because I didn't want to identify as a person who was losing their vision and needed it. Was that the case for you, or how did you come to terms with using the white cane?
Oh, it's huge. The cane is the cane is the villain of the book. It's the thing I'm avoiding. It's the thing I'm avoiding because I don't know how to relate to it. And I did understand intuitively that when I pick up a white cane, I'll never put it down again. And so the book is me deferring that moment as long as I can. And for me, the trick was, I used punk rock as camouflage. So I would go to nightclubs, because I could bang around and bump into people, and they would just think I was drunk, and it was acceptable. And so I spent a lot of time in nightclubs in my early 20s, not because I was having a great time, but because it's what I called my nihilistic spasm period, where I was just there avoiding the outside world. And this was the last sort of corner I could imagine where it was okay to be graceless.
Right.
But when the cane came, it was that strange process of walking around with a cane and feeling like a fraud, even though you need it. But, maybe 90% of the time I didn't, but there'd be that 10% of the time I did, and I didn't know when it would be. Right. And so I'd be sort of casually caning around, and, you just look like an asshole. You look like a sighted person with a cane.
Right.
And you get, I still had enough tunnel vision that I could see the skeptical looks. And it makes you not want to go out. So, and it took me a while to sort of understand that blindness is literally a loss of sight. But I think blindness is more functionally for me understood as a mobility problem, and as it's a glitch of mobility, and it's two main problems for me. Like the things that were really causing me trouble weren't blindness itself, but it was safety, like having to be safe all the time, and embarrassment. Like those are the two things that keep you at home, because if you pursue safety, you become bored. Yeah. And boredom is a big thing. But you also don't want to challenge yourself too much, because it leads to so much embarrassment. And so I put the word blindness aside for a long time, because those were really the emotional things I had to confront. And blindness is more of an abstraction in some ways. Like it doesn't describe a lived reality, but humiliation, embarrassment, boredom, those are the real things that you're wrestling with in your immediate environment every day when you wake up. Right. So, and the way you do that is, I think the cure for my blindness was stories. that everything becomes material. You know,
Right.
Spalding Gray had that great line. Oh, poor Spalding Gray. He had that great line where he said, "I'd rather tell my life than live it." And there is something true in the idea that, how do I describe? Well, you know, when my daughter Tess was like 3 or 4, I guess, maybe even a bit younger actually. Maybe she was 2, but she was at daycare. I picked her up after school, and she climbed on my back, and I'm caning out of the daycare with this little girl on my back, which is just terrifying all the mothers and fathers. And came down the hall, and she slipped off and she fell on the floor, and she started to cry. And so I'm trying to pick her up and stuff and dust her off. And then she just stopped crying. And she said, "I've got a good story for mommy." And it's like, it took me 38 years to figure out that that was the cure, that if you turn it into a story, it can't hurt you.
Right.
And it's just, it's a way of moving through the world and protecting yourself from it. Because when it's funny, you're faster than the world. You know, if it's funny, it can't hurt.
True.
And so, you know, I had to write a book to figure that out. She just had to fall off me at a daycare. She figured it out.
Yeah, it comes at different stages of everyone's life.
Different
for sure.
stages, yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. Getting back to Cockeyed for a second. I mean, in it, you talk a lot about your family and the experiences you had. And I'm just wondering what it was like telling or retelling or remembering those stories, putting them in the book, and how did your family react to having them included, or how they were portrayed in the book?
Yeah, it's always the $1 million question. I get, you know, students when I teach creative writing ask, you know, how do you deal with writing about people that you still live with, that are still in your life? And I mean, there's a very simple way of looking at it, which is you never write something that you wouldn't say to their face in front of another person, because that is the dynamic of a book. You're saying something in front of other people. So I use that as sort of my guide of like, if I wouldn't be willing to say this to my mother or to my father or to my siblings in front of a stranger, then I shouldn't put it in the book. And you sort of push the edge of those things a little bit. You know, I think the 2 most interesting things that came out of that were, I think when the first book review came out, somebody referred in that review, described my brother's death as a suicide. Right. And it is painfully ambiguous in the book what actually happened, as it was in real life, that he overdosed. We don't know if it was deliberate or if it was accidental. It was most likely accidental, but it had to be ruled as death by, you know, misadventure. But when that was casually described as a suicide in the review, my mother just lost her shit.
Right.
And what I realized is I can control what I put in the book, but I can't control the way other people talk about it.
Right.
And maybe misunderstand things or characterize them differently. So that was sort of an interesting and difficult, you know, sort of lesson on the other side. And then the other one was, I was on a plane actually coming back from Toronto, and my former partner Jane in the book, who's hearing impaired, I hadn't seen her in years, and she's in the book. And you know, I changed her name, and I didn't write about her extensively because I didn't kind of want to go back and reopen those things. So I kept it, you know, sort of fairly on the comfortable public domain of our story.
Right. Right.
And anyway, I was on this plane, and she just suddenly squatted down beside me in the aisle, and it was another 4 hours, and she had my book in her hand, and she said, "I'm just reading your book." And I was like, "Oh no!"
There's awkward silence.
There was a very awkward silence. I said, "So, what do you think so far?" And she said, "A little more than halfway through." I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "I think you weren't hard enough on yourself."
Okay.
And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, going back to my nihilist spasm period, she said, there were times that you didn't come home for a couple days, and I didn't know where you were. And there was a lot of stuff that I thought, yeah, I forgot that. And so even though, you know, I did a lot of research in my memoir, like there, you know, stories that I tell in there that I know so well because they happened to me and I've relived them in my own mind over and over. I still would consult, like, my mother or my father or anybody else involved to see from their point of view what I might not know and what might have been missing. And Jane was the only person I didn't do that with, just because I didn't want to re-engage it. And
Right.
so I think I got some stuff wrong in there, and it sort of made me feel too like if you went back, you would probably write a book differently every time, even if it's a memoir.
Oh, for sure.
Like there is no one memoir. Every time I would go back and rewrite this thing, it would be a different story. To some degree,
for sure.
you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. And especially if, I mean, you wrote it 15 years ago. I mean, your life is so different now if you were to write it again today.
Yeah. And you think about different things, right? You probably put different stories in and take other ones out. You think something is really important at the time, and then later you find out in your own memory, like maybe it wasn't as important and this other thing was actually more important. So
right, exactly.
It's a shifting relationship to your own past.
Absolutely. When you were writing it, and as you said, you consulted with your family members, did you, I'm assuming you said, I'm planning to write about this event or this situation. How do you remember it? Is there anything that you would like me to include or not include? So what sort of conversations did you have with your family around what was put in the book?
There wasn't really a ton, because like I left home pretty young. Like I was 18 when I moved out, and
right.
I wasn't diagnosed until I was 18. So most of my story happens on the other side.
Right. Okay.
But there was a big moment in the book where I had so many car accidents before we found out I was losing my sight. I've said over the years that I was diagnosed by cars before a doctor.
Right. Yep.
And my editor even said, we've got too many car accidents, and we pick a couple. And so we did. And, there was this one story that was central, where I put my father's car in a ditch at about 2 miles an hour. And if I'd done it at like 50 miles an hour, I would have been a normal teenager. But because I did it so slow, it scared everybody.
Right.
And he thought I was drunk. Like he thought I had been at a party, because it was the only way we could explain why this happened. Like, how did I miss a turn by 20 feet and put the car in this massive ditch so slowly?
Yeah.
And I thought he was right, because I had a beer at a party. I'm like, maybe this is what drunk driving feels like, after one beer. But he didn't talk to me for a couple of weeks because he was so mad about it. And my mother just felt like something was off. And so I went and had my eyes checked, because I already wore thick glasses. And that was the appointment in which he said, it looks like you have the beginnings of RP. You are developing night blindness.
Yeah.
And they were going to send me to a specialist. And that was my 18th birthday. And we were driving home from the doctor's office, me and my father. And we drove past that spot where I put his car in the ditch, and he sighed. And it was sort of this bull sigh. And I realized, like, he was just looking at that spot and feeling so guilty for not having believed me when I kept saying, I don't know how this happened. I don't know why.
Right. Yeah.
And normally when I told that story, that's where it stops. But I realized that there was sort of, as a book, the audience is going to say, well, what happened with your mom? Like, you just found out you're losing your sight. How did you tell her? Because she wasn't with us at the doctor's office.
Right.
And I never really chased the story that far when I would just tell it, at dinner or whatever. And I had to phone my mother, because I didn't actually remember. And you would think you would remember telling your mother you're losing your sight.
Right.
I think that would be a big moment. But I couldn't remember doing it. And I'm like, maybe I didn't. Like, I don't remember how she found out. And so I phoned her, and she remembered. And she said, oh, I totally remember. You came home with your dad. Everybody was at the house because it was your birthday. And we were all getting ready for dinner. And you walked in the door, and your dad like waved to you to go downstairs to your room. And he came into the kitchen and he told me. And my relationship with my dad changed after that, after finding that out, because I wasn't there to see it or to really understand it. But he had taken, like, it would have been one of the worst moments of my life to tell my mother I'm going to go blind. And he did it for me, so I wouldn't have to have that extra pain in that day. And to know that he quietly did that for me, he didn't ask me, he just saw it coming and stepped in before I could get there. There was a generosity in that and a kind of empathy in that I thought was so profound. And I was just astonished it wasn't part of my memory.
Right.
So if I hadn't written the book, I wouldn't have known that moment.
Interesting. Very interesting. One of the It's interesting you talk about your many car crashes, because that's one of the stories that I really related to when I read the book. Because I had a similar situation when I was 16. I was diagnosed at 17, but I grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario, and everyone learns to drive at 16. And I remember my dad taking me out to a back road and putting me behind the wheel. And as a result, I almost drove us into a tree.
Mhm.
And like your situation, it was sort of the first inkling of there might be something wrong. And then from there, went and got tested and was diagnosed. So
Right.
yeah, I related to a lot of your stories in the book, but that was one of them.
Doesn't it make you wonder how often disability, undiagnosed disability, is the underpinning of most slapstick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And I tell that story to my friends.
Maybe Wile E. Coyote just had RP. That's why he kept running off cliffs.
Exactly. That would put a whole new spin on that cartoon.
Yeah. It's the undiagnosed misadventures of Wile E. Coyote with early onset RP.
RP, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I tell that story to friends now, and initially they're horrified, and then we just end up laughing about it because it is so comedic and so hilarious.
Yeah. Well, so after the book came out, I was driving, because I still teach at Capilano University in Vancouver, and I was carpooling to work with Stan Persky, who taught in the philosophy department. He was a great writer from the old Allen Ginsberg scene in San Francisco. And so he and I would commute together, and he picked me up on the corner. And Stan always had this sort of point of view on the world that I found so uplifting, because he was the happiest guy I've ever known. He was always content. And part of his trick was he would narrate his life to himself as he was going through it. So we'd be driving to school, and he'd be like, big truck trying to pass us by, got to get where big trucks go. And it just like, oh yeah, telling your life does make it different. And so I got in the car, and the book had just come out, and he had read it. And he said, so we're driving away, he said, so I read your book. And I said, so what'd you think? And he said, I think you figured it out. And I said, I don't think I figured anything out. He said, no, I think you figured it out. There's the first thing you figured out is the response in here to trauma. And he said, it's Bertolt Brecht, I think, had this. I think it was Bertolt Brecht he'd said, but he said there's one choice. The choice is to react with either irony or suicide. And he didn't mean literally like kill yourself, but it's like the attitude to trauma is you either laugh at it or you let it hurt you.
Right.
And that is the fundamental choice in any moment of drama, is whether or not you receive it ironically or painfully. And so you're right. Like, I did not set out to write a funny book. It came out funny because the book was a document of the process of me finding my ironic way of carrying blindness through the rest of my life.
Yeah, exactly.
You're reading me find a way to carry it.
Yeah, and I think that's the case for a lot of us who are trying to navigate losing our sight or any disability, and how we sort of be productive in a sighted world in our cases. And
I want to be clear,
deal.
like, I really want to be clear, like, when he said irony or suicide, he does not mean them as literal things. He means them as metaphorical ideas.
Of course,
and as metaphorical attitudes towards experience.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on a good, interesting point in terms of how the book was received by others. And I'm wondering, when you went on tour with this book after it was published, what sort of reactions did you get from readers and your audience?
So, I mean, there's sort of two big things that still stick with me about the experience of this book coming out. I mean, it got lots of great response from people, but sort of two interesting things I had not anticipated. One was the diagnosis scene in the book of like me with the doctor is incredibly short. It's almost a pencil sketch. Like, we don't spend much time in the doctor's office. I don't get into a lot of detail about it. It's really like, I'm in the office. He says you're losing your sight. I'm staring at the goldfish on his desk, and I think, I'm fine. I can still see this fish.
Right.
And that's sort of the scene. And my editor and I had this deliberate thing. And I said, I don't want to get into the maudlin, sentimental, almost pornographic thing of the trauma of being diagnosed, because that doctor scene is such a trope in books like this, where you find out your life is going to change, and on the other, as soon as you leave this office. So I wanted to keep it really small, almost like a blind spot in the book. And because really it's the consequence of it that mattered to me, not the actual diagnosis.
Right.
It's the life after it.
Yeah.
So I kept it really small like that. That was my deliberate sort of joke to myself. It's like a blind spot in the book. And it's the moment everybody expects to really be dwelled in. Right. Anyway, I cannot tell you how many people came up to me on the book tour and told me how moving the doctor scene in the book was. Even though there really isn't one. And the lesson from that is disability stories in our culture, be it in film or theater or literary arts, disability stories are so front-loaded that unless you disarm your audience very quickly and make them open to receiving it in a new way, they will project onto that story an assumption of what happens in it. They will turn it into a triumph of the human spirit story and all that bullshit that we're all used to. Right? They turn you into inspiration.
Yep.
Right. I mean, because that's the thing. It's like you lose your sight, any disability, you also become inspirational right after.
Well, absolutely.
They might as well say it to you at the hospital. It's like, we're sorry we couldn't save your legs, but at least now you're inspirational.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that was, and I've used that as a screenwriter ever since. That, if you're in a disability genre or a genre in which it's a true story of somebody who's going to undergo a radical transformation like that, you have to disarm the audience very quickly to make them open to receiving any kind of story that they would otherwise just assume it's not.
Right.
That's how powerful the tropes are. And that tells you how much work has to be done to dismantle them. Yep. And then the other thing was, our culture has a funny thing of turning memoirs into expertise. Like, just because I wrote a memoir about losing my sight doesn't mean I'm good at losing my sight.
Right.
And so, and I would get a lot of, particularly parents of teens, reaching out where they had a teenage son or daughter who's going through RP or something similar, and reaching out and saying, I read your book. I asked them to read the book, but they don't want to. I understand that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the parents are like, you seem so well adjusted and affable. How do they get there? And it's like, well, I wrote a memoir. Doesn't mean I can tell you how to help your kid.
Everyone's process is different, for sure.
And the only thing I do know is the fact that you're reaching out to me and that you read the book and they haven't means they're not there yet. Like,
exactly.
And you can't get them there. Like, if anything, the only reason I got here is because I fell down hard enough that I had to stand back up.
Yep.
And I was just lucky it didn't kill me when I fell down that hard. But I sort of marvel at my own parents that they actually stood by and just watched and let me fail. And I'm still, as a father myself now, I'm baffled, like utterly baffled, that my working class parents were okay with the fact that I came home one day as an 18-year-old who was losing his sight and said, you know what, I'm going to go to school and study avant-garde poetry. Like that was going to make my life better. That was going to save me. That was the career they wanted me to change. But they said, you do you. And it was a profound bravery, I think, of parenting to let me do that. I don't know if I'd have that bravery myself if my own kid went through that.
Interesting.
I'd be like, become a baker. Go become a baker.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you are fortunate that your parents allowed you to be you and do you and fall down, like you said, hard and get back up and learn how to go on with your life. My parents were very much the same. When I left for university, first time out of a small town, Northern Ontario town, they were incredibly anxious, and they just had to let me fall. Like, same with your parents.
That was no way around it.
Sorry to
Yep.
interrupt. This is Angela speaking.
Yep.
I just want to let Darren and Ryan know that we have about 10 minutes left, and to let the audience know that if you have any questions for Darren or Ryan, please submit them into the chat, or have it on good authority from Darren and Ryan that you can also just unmute and interrupt like I have done with any questions you may have. And yeah, feel free to go on, or we can move on to some fun questions.
It's totally up to you, Ryan, if you want to continue chatting, or we can take some questions.
Are there questions there? If I'm happy to take questions if there are, and if not, we can chat a little bit while people are thinking of some.
Yes, I think that would be best if you want to chat for about a couple more minutes, and then I will interrupt if somebody else has a question. Okay.
So maybe one thing I just wanted to touch on, like moving away from Cockeyed for our last few minutes, and just you talked about being a parent. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience. I mean, you wrote a second book about being a father with a disability, and how's your life been during COVID? And as a person with a disability, writer with a disability, how's your life been over the last year? I know that's a big question, but
it's a big question. Well, I'm trying to figure it out still. Like I'd moved down to LA last February because I was still working on In the Dark, and we were starting to write season 3. So I moved down there to go into the writer's room, and the room kept getting deferred because we think maybe the showrunner had COVID in February because she was really sick.
Right.
So we pushed it and pushed it. We finally started the room in March, and that was when things started getting really crazy. And we did 1 week in the writer's room on the show, and then our showrunner said, "I think we should start working remotely." And we were one of the first shows to go remote. And I said, "Well, if I just have to stay in my apartment and work on Zoom," which we are still like, Zoom was like, nobody knew what Zoom was yet.
Exactly, it was still a new thing at that point.
I said, "Well, can I go back up to Canada if that's the case? Because I don't want to be the blind guy in LA trying to get toilet paper when everybody else is like stealing it off shelves, rationing it." And she said, "Sure, come back in a couple of weeks when things settle down." So I came back up to Canada, and my wife and I were building a house out here in Ucluelet on the west coast of Vancouver Island. We live in Vancouver. We had bought some land, and we were building this little house out here, which is ultimately where we wanted to kind of retire one day and spend more time because I surf out here. And so COVID, when I got home, I flew back up to Canada, and it was just like, it was getting scary. And we just looked at the city, and I'm like, I'm going to be housebound for the next year or two. Because if I walk outside to take out the garbage, I bump into 2 people looking at their phones. And I'm like, am I going to get COVID taking out the garbage?
You're right.
And I can't take a bus. I'm not going to take taxis. I'm not going to walk into a store and know where to move anymore in my neighborhood. All the things I'd memorized didn't apply anymore.
Yeah.
And the spaces were all different. And we looked at it and we're like, we should get out of the city. It's actually a less safe place. And I've said over the years, like, the city was the soft technology that allowed me to become the blind person I am, because I could walk everywhere and I had an independence in my neighborhood of 25 years.
Yep.
And when COVID hit, the city ceased to be. The city disappeared.
Yep.
And so we came out here to the coast the next day. Like, I flew in on a Friday, and Saturday morning we threw our crap in a car and we drove out here, and we've never been back. Like, we're staying. And so I'm now living out here, like in some cedar forest by the ocean. And that's what COVID did to me. It drove me, I'm fortunate, it drove me out of the city and I had somewhere to go. But I decided that COVID changed my relationship to the city. And it wasn't something I'd anticipated. So I came out here, and I've been training to become a blind surfer at the age of 40.
Very cool. Very cool.
This project. And the project was, like, I don't really know what it's about. Like, I'm paddling out every day into the void.
Right.
It's like I just paddle out into nothing. And my coach tells me, after this wave, it's a right. And I catch it and I go quickly. And I hope not to mow people down like the Grim Reaper. But there's a kind of strange rediscovery of my body in a new environment. You know, I'm a certain different person in the city, and so I think I've started a new chapter in my life by moving out here, and I'm writing a little less, and I'm surfing more, and you know, it's just, I don't know, I'm out in the trails, and
yeah, for sure.
I'm actually thinking about getting a seeing eye dog for the first time in my life.
Oh, interesting.
My life here differently, to live differently out here.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt
COVID's
this.
changed that.
Oh, hello. This is Angela again. Sorry to interrupt this profound conversation, but we have a question from Leslie. So Leslie, if you want to turn your microphone on and ask your question.
Hi, Ryan and Darren. It's really nice to meet you both over
You too.
Zoom.
You too, for sure.
Ryan, thanks so much for doing this. It's so great to hear you talk.
Thanks.
And so in addition to reading your books like years and years ago when I was researching for the show, I somehow managed, and I can't remember how, got a hold of a documentary of you, I think through a friend of a friend who knew the documentary filmmaker, about your pilgrimage to that church in Germany, to hear the cage piece, the slowest piece ever. And
That's right.
And I wondered if you could talk about your relationship to cage, or how you came across that and sort of the start of that.
Oh, such a great question. What Leslie's referring to is Scott Smith, the Canadian filmmaker and TV director, made a documentary about me in 2009, I think it was, called As Slow as Possible, or ASAP, if you're into irony. And that's the name of the John Cage piece. So he wrote this 4-page composition for pipe organ, or for organ. And but the signature, the musical signature for the tempo is As Slow as Possible. And it's got spaces on the score. So like the distance between 2 notes proportionately tells you how long it should take compared to other notes. So if you think of it as like a musical score in that sense, but you can play it as slow as you want. So they're trying to perform this song over 600 and some odd years. They're stretching it out. It'll be the half-life of this one pipe organ in Germany. Well, so like half its life will be just playing this one song. And it's been going for, I don't know, like 12 years now. And when we went, I think they were beginning, it was like the 3rd note or 4th note, and it had already been going for a year and a half. And then it's like at year 300, there's an intermission for a decade or something, you know, so you can have a break. So I did that because I actually started this project of travel writing, and I became a travel writer over the last decade. And my question was, if I had to go somewhere in the world just to smell something, what would I go smell? Like, what is the Eiffel Tower of sound? What is the Grand Canyon of textures? And so rather than sightseeing, if you change your pursuit in terms of your body and your senses, where do you go in the world for those things? Like, you know, I'm not going to go look at the Mona Lisa. So what am I going to go smell? That would be the equivalent. And so things like As Slow as Possible started emerging to me as ideas for travel. So I wanted to go hear one note change that'll never change again in this song that's going to play for 600 years. I'm going to go witness it. And I was the only person in the church that day, and it's on a farm in a little town called Halberstadt in Germany. And it was profound for me, like just knowing that I was there when this one thing was going to happen that would never happen again. And it was part of a big, long project that would outlive anybody involved in it. So to me, that felt like, oh, that is worth going to listen to. And ever since then, I've been doing all these sort of trips like that around sensory experiences that are not for sightseeing. So I went to the world's biggest rattlesnake roundup in Texas, so I could hear what like 700 rattlesnakes sound like at once. I went to Murano to blow glass with, on the island of Murano near Venice, where they do glass blowing. I did butchery in Italy with Dario, the master butcher, who's in Bill Buford's book Heat. I went there and I got to spend a day with him learning how to try and butcher by touch. So, and the reason I did all that, because I'll wrap this up. I mean, the reason I did all that was because I realized that in living where I did, I'd have these like 4 square blocks that I spent most of my time in off Commercial Drive in Vancouver. And I had this rich mental map of that place because I'd walked it so many times. And like, I know the pattern to press on the bank machine buttons. I know where the cream is at the coffee shop I hang out at. But when I would leave those 4 square blocks, the world got smaller instead of bigger because I don't have a mental map of what's beyond it. And so it felt like, well, that's what you should write about then. If the world is getting smaller when you go out into it, if it gets more, if it becomes a problem, there's probably a story there. And so that became sort of my strange travel project I've been doing over the years. So I write for Afar magazine now as a contributing writer, and they'll send me on a trip usually maybe once a year. And it's around something like this, some sort of pursuit like that.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Darren. I just want to say that unfortunately we are out of time, sadly, because honestly I can listen to both of you forever. And I just want to say on behalf of Theater Pass Marai that we are deeply grateful to both you, Darren and Ryan, for this amazing, hilarious, poignant conversation today. And I also want to take this moment to thank our ASL interpreter, Denica. Thank you so much for your work today. Thank you to the TPM staff, Caradwin, Emily, Jen, and all the rest of the TPM team for all their work on this event. And just 2 final things before we close our doors for today, our virtual doors for today. Number one, that this wonderful conversation with Ryan is a part of our Prelude community engagement programming that's inspired by Leslie Ting's show Speculation. Directed by Alex Baumer, creator Leslie Ting takes the audience through witnessing her mother's loss of vision and eventual passing in this digital reimagining of a theatrical concert. Created through projections and music from both Beethoven and John Cage, this new online experience features experimental film and a collective performance of Cage's 433. Speculation has also been created to include audiences who are blind or have low vision and is complete as an auditory experience. And in addition to its strong oral aesthetic, the show will include a series of projections that may be that artistically expresses how differing forms of vision loss affect seeing. So I welcome that you all check out our website, passmarai.ca, on more information about this stunning show. And it is pay what you can afford, starting as low as $5. And finally, I just want to say that give a shout out to Another Story Bookshop, who is our bookseller partner for this season. As a part of this partnership, they are providing us with a 10% off discount code for their online store. When you place an online order on anotherstory.ca, all you need to do is mention TP Marai Book Club discount in the comments box, and then the 10% discount will be manually applied. All this information will be sent to you on an email after the event so that you can also support Ryan's writing and purchase a copy of his works. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. And I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks, Ryan. It was great speaking with you this afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me.